So our guide in looking at ideology and the Chinese Communist Party is going to be Professor Timothy Cheek. And we are so fortunate to have him with us. He is a professor of history at Vancouver's University of British Columbia, and he also heads the university's Institute of Asian Research. He was educated at Australian National University, Virginia, and Harvard, and has been working for many years on intellectuals in Chinese history, modern Chinese history, and emphasizing the political thought of many of these individuals. One of his recent books is The Intellectual in Modern Chinese History. His first book was China's Establishment Intellectuals. And he's also written about propaganda and the role of intellectuals in that. And today he'll be introducing to us a character, Wang Shiwei, and talking about those experiences. He's also written extensively on Mao, from his collection, The Secret Speeches of Chairman Mao, from the 100 Flowers movement through the Great Leap Forward. And he has been translating and editing a lot more of this. His most recent book in this vein is Mao Zedong's Road to Power, which he is a translator and editor for volume 8 of that. Those of you who are involved in teaching, you've probably used his critical introduction to Mao, or his very, very short volume, Mao Zedong and China's Revolution, Brief History with Documents. This is just touching on some of the work that he's been doing, including work on broader Chinese issues, such as living with reform, China since 1989. But today, we're going to have him with us to talk about ideology, something that he has written extensively on, including a wonderful piece in 2018, Make China Marxist Again, which is in some ways a lead-in to where he takes us with his article about Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping's counter-reformation and use of ideology. It is a great pleasure to bring Timothy Cheek here to our webinar. Tim, take it away.
Clay and I got to talking about the 100th anniversary and some of the work that I've been doing. And so we came down with questions of ideology and contestation in the party from Mao to Xi. Come on. Now, why won't it like, there it goes, There you go. And so really, two things I've been doing in the past year is this edited volume with Hans van der Ven and Klaus Milhan, and 8 colleagues, 7 or 8 other colleagues. And so this is the book that Clay mentioned. And what happened is in the 2018, Klaus and I got a bunch of our colleagues together who've been working on party history, but not for a while. Then certainly by 2015, everyone started to realize that we better look at the party again. And so we got some folks together in Berlin, including colleagues from PRC, happily, and also Ishikawa Yoshihiro from Japan and others, to talk about what to do. And we were completely overwhelmed. There's so much excellent research going on in China today, broadly around the Xinde the new revolutionary history. But it was Hans who saved us from being stuck. And he said, why don't we try something that's at least attempts to be popular and draw on the model of the BBC's A History of the World in 100 Objects. And so for those of you who are more China history oriented, I think of this book as our humble attempt to write like Timothy Brooke, my colleague up here at UBC. You know, if I'm honest, I couldn't write a book like Vermeer's Hat, but I maybe could write a chapter. And so we've got, I've just given you the names of the Chinese who are covered. The authors range from some well-known senior colleagues, 2 from inside China, Zhang Jishun and Xu Jinping, and a range of men and women in Europe and North America and China. So that's what we started to do. The themes of the book was really to provide something different from the two grand narratives that we have. The party as grand, as Beijing is telling us, and the party as something awful, as the Wall Street Journal and the Washington and others are telling us. And so as historians, we wanted to give a sense of the difference of the experience of the Communist Party over the century. And you'll notice that we start with a Dutchman. Of course, Sneevliet was the Comintern representative. Wang Ming, a forgotten general secretary. Wang Shiwei, the one I worked on, and I've been interested in him for a long time, in the Yenan rectification. Shangguan Yunzhu, Zhang Jishun, a beautiful piece on what happens to a cultural star in the 1950s. Wang Guangmei, Liz Perry is a tour de force article of Wang Guangmei, who pushed hard for mass criticism in the socialist education movement, only to get on the receiving end of it only a few years later in the Cultural Revolution, a real tragedy story, or a Greek tragedy. We had to deal with Mao, but rather naughtily, we dealt with the death of Mao and the life of Mao's thought with Chairman Gonzalo, with the Shining Path. And then Zhao Ziyang, the Voices of Reform, another general secretary who's been erased from the story that we get in Beijing. Wang Yuanhua, a very active Chinese party intellectual, but by the 1990s has his Hohui, has reflects some of the alienation that Chinese intellectuals have had with the party. Jiang Zemin and the Naughty Oddies is really about the Jiang Zemin period with the zeros when he's not even party secretary anymore, general secretary, but of course we know his influence boomed. And then the real turnaround, and this is from Guo Binyang, Guo Meimei. And those of you who have been following it, and I guess I must know too, Guo Meimei came up on the internet in 2010, 11, 12, and really showed the distance from the party from the life of the internet China. So the long term of party history. But I'm going to come back in these 3 minutes and talk about this is that other article. That's all joint work, aside from my article on Wang Shiwei, who was a Marxist critique of Mao, but lost. What I've been interested in the last couple of years is thinking about what is the Xi Jinping's ideology and what's going on and why does this feel familiar and what is it? And we all know that people are saying he's a lot like Mao, and you'll see that I have an alternative version or a twist on that. And this is a quote that I think I see quoted quite a bit. It's from December 2018. And it's the bottom half I'm interested in particularly. To uphold the party's leadership, which is the major principle that determines the future and the destiny of the party and the country, the entire party and the whole country must without wavering maintain a high degree of ideological consciousness, political consciousness, and consciousness of action. What's with all this consciousness? My basic thesis and what I argue in the new article is ideological governance. So what is that? So here's my best shot. Pick it apart. I'd be interested to see what people say, but this is what I see going on. Ideological governance asserts a role for the government as a pedagogical state that has the responsibility to provide order and prosperity through civilizing its citizens, according to the superior insights of certified transformational bureaucrats, learned in a body of thought that, when applied properly, will bring great harmony to all under its sway, and which, therefore, requires and deserves freedom from competition from alternative and presumably lesser forms of political activity. In the published work, I go through and try to trace and give some examples of this ideological governance. The point is, there is something about this that is not limited to Mao or Xi and goes deeper. How deeper and how and what? The analytical category that I prefer is statecraft, Chinese statecraft, political thought. And so we have the social habitus of ideological governance we can see in imperial, republican, socialist China. We can go through examples of that from the village lectures and the Xuanjiang, the sacred edict lectures, amongst other things in the Qing. Also Sun Yat-sen's and Chiang Kai-shek's claim to be ideological leaders I'm a great fan of John Fitzgerald's book, Awakening China. And any of us who want to understand 20th century Chinese ideology should read that book twice. Most of what I thought we should lay at the feet of Mao, turns out it started with Sun Yat-sen. But of course, it is the communists' own traditions that are relevant today, and that is the rectification politics of the Yenan rectification in the 1940s. In between then and now, between Mao and Xi, we have the reform Leninism, which steps back from ideological governance under Hu Yaobang, Jiao Ziyang, Jiang Zemin. It's regulations plus science, Lenin-style NEP policies. And so this sets up for the metaphor that I find useful. Obviously, it's invoking the medieval Catholic Church, Xi Jinping's Counter-reformation, which is reasserting active ideological governance. So, we can go into Yenan, and those of you who've studied a fair amount of, modern Chinese history know all about the rectification movement and the Mao Zedong's famous speeches, reform our study, reform our party, and the thought reform that was carried out in the 1942-44 rectification campaign. What we tend to forget is that, Mao couldn't make everybody do it. You had to have transformational bureaucrats and other leaders to enforce and to explain and to operationalize. And Liu Shaoqi has a famous essay called The Cultivation of the Communist Party Member, also translated as How to Become a Good Communist. And we're all sort of vaguely aware of that. I went back and of course, led by Stuart Schramm, went and found the original version, which turns out to be twice as long as the version that is in the post-1949 selected works version of Liu Shaoqi's work. And it is an extremely detailed operationalization of what we think of as Maoist thought reform and ideological struggle in the formation of revolutionary cadres. And his key term is gaizao, the need to reform cadres, their habits and their thought, because they come from the old society. Look at this quote. Does this look familiar from what we had a minute ago? The cultivation of every communist must first and all be cultivation of ideological consciousness. It's 思想意识. The cultivation of ideology is the basis of all other cultivation. And we can go through, as I have in ponderous detail elsewhere, the themes that we find in this seminal piece. Of course, Liu Shaoqi's cultivation essay, a portion of it was in the rectification documents, which was the Bible of the rectification campaign in 1942. Continue the revolution after the seizure of power. It's a 100-year task. He uses the term 百年大业, right? Because we have bad ideology from our childhood under the old society. We have to have continued reform and rectification. Subordination to the interests of the party makes sense if the party really has no selfish interest, that it's really 为共. And of course, Liu Shaoqi holds that. Liu does offer a noble and cosmopolitan vision, the emancipation of all working people. Several times he says, the emancipation of the Chinese working class in China cannot be completed until all working people are emancipated. Now, whether he lived that out or not is another question. The themes that come up: loyalty, party nos, party spirit, awakened proletarian vanguard. I think we can find all of these in spades in Xi Jinping's writings or writings attributed to Xi Jinping. And most interestingly is ideology and ideological struggle. We think of those things, we think of red guards, and we think of denunciations, and we think of the inquisitional from the cleansing the class ranks campaign during the Cultural Revolution. Liu Shaoqi and people like Peng Zheng, Deng Tuo, other people I studied, for them, ideological struggle was a very rigorous, very ordered, had rules and regulations of how to do it. And you have to say, talk about frank assessment of the faults of cadres. Liu Shaoqi is very clear. And when we do see little bits of what Xi Jinping thinks about his own cadres today, he's pretty negative as well. So the point is that the ideology from Mao to Xi does these things. Mao Zedong thought for what to do, how to do it, why to do it. Democratic centralism, which takes up half of Liu Shaoqi's essay on cultivation, mobilize cadres and citizens, manage conflict, and to manage the economy. Self and mutual criticism, to ingrain correct thought, reinforce norms, as well as remove bad thought. Rectification depends on the power of correct thought. This is philosophical idealism in the most amazing sense, and the impact of a mobilized, faithful cadre of leaders to implement it. I didn't think this stuff up. Ken Jowett was talking about this in his wonderful 1978 pamphlet, short booklet on the Leninist response to national dependency, and of course recapitulated in his 1992 book. Joe Fewsmith has said it very well in his new book coming out this year on rethinking Chinese politics. So between Mao and Xi, we have the communist reformation, regulations plus science, the kind of the Lenin economic policies of the NEP. So a Leninist revival under Deng Xiaoping and Peng Zhan, revival against what? Against the chiliastic Maoist street stuff. CCP reformations under Zhao Ziyang and Jiang Zemin. We can go into the details as you need. And this has brought a counter-reformation since 2010 under Xi Jinping, wherein he believes the problems that China are facing today are due to a failure to keep to the faith of the Yenan rectification. So a rejection of the NEP approach. So my basic thesis, I'm throwing it out for you today, Xi's ideology as Liu Shaoqi 2.0, ideological governance for the new era. So as Joe Fewsmith, you'll see in his book says, Xi is putting the Lenin back in Leninism. The difference between Mao and Xi is when Mao wanted to shake up the party, he went to the students, he got to the masses, right? He did street fighting. What did Liu Shaoqi do? He sent in work teams. What is the Discipline Inspection Commission? It's a giant work team. And that's what Xi Jinping does. This is Maoism, but it's more Liu Shaoqi style, bureaucratic Maoism, or I've translated it as Xinjiang Maozhi in the Weberian sense. And of course, that's in Liu Shaoqi's piece. So the little red book that you see down there, I got from Stuart Schramm when I was working with him. And it's a 1947 edition of writings by Liu Shaoqi. So when I have my students, I say, put down your little Mao Zedong Yulu and pick up this book and get to read. And so that's the Liu Shaoqi. It is worth noting that it's still able to attract some intellectual talent. Jiang Shigong, a very well-known and very capable constitutional theorist, sings paeans to Xi Jinping thought. And David Ownby has translated a couple of his essays that are, I think, very important. If you want to have an intelligent understanding of what Xi Jinping is trying to push, Jiang Shigong is your man. But that said, the century of party history, as we've tried to reflect in the 10 Lives volume, shows alternatives to rectification politics, from Wang Ming's cosmopolitan Popular Front approach to Zhao Ziyang's more practical NEP approach. And in the end, what I'm suggesting to us all is the value of paying attention to traditions of Chinese statecraft that inform Xi Jinping's and colleagues' counter-reformation today.
And that is quite a lot. Thank you, Tim. That was terrific, a tour de force. And just as a reminder, you have in the chat links to the Chinese Communist Party, to the publisher's website. I have the ebook version, which is quite convenient, and so I'd encourage you to get that. And we also have in the chat a link to the article that Tim was just referring to, Xi Jinping's Counter-reformation. Thank you so much. We already have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those in just a second. But I wanted to turn first to my esteemed colleague at the University of Southern California, Professor Yang. Aimee, what would you like to ask?
I actually have two questions. First of all, I want to say, I'm really fascinated by Dr. Chek's work. It's really interesting, even though this type of research is not in my sort of normal research area, but I find it very interesting. The first question that's kind of like burning in my chest was like this phenomena of ideological reformation and how that connect to the rising nationalism that we observe through our own data analysis from Chinese social media. The phenomena that I was talking about was like in recent years, when we collect data from social media, from China, oftentimes we saw like there is a rising sentiment that really signals nationalism. I wonder if that has some connection with Xi's approach towards ideological sort of purity. The idea was like for years when people talk about public intellectuals, for example, it oftentimes tends to be very much in admiration, and they like them. They like the idea of Western lifestyle and things like that. But recently, when we start collect data, when people talk about NGOs, for example, they oftentimes think they're puppets of the Western government. And when people talk about public intellectuals or Western way of life or even democracy or things that we hold very sort of at high esteem, nowadays seems like the general citizens, like netizens, people who are on social media, a lot of them have very negative attitudes towards that. I think there are many different sort of explanations for why that could be happening. And I wonder what your thoughts are about the connection between that and Xi's approach towards this sort of ideological dominance.
Well, it's a great question. And it reflects a really important research that you and your colleagues are doing. I, of course, focus pretty much on the party. And so I limited myself to the 90 million. And so, you know, Xi Jinping's interest in controlling them. And in a way, my sense is that, and again, you know, I do use the sort of Catholic Church, medieval Catholic Church as a metaphor. Liz Perry reminded me the other day that her colleagues at Berkeley, you know, decades ago were making the same thing. Again, it's not a new one. It's because it's an ideological institution that has a bank and it has an institution, but it also has some kind of transcendent and moral claims, though it doesn't always by any means live up to them. And so with Xi Jinping, in that sense, he's not that interested, my sense, and I don't think Liu Shaoqi was either, in changing the hearts and minds of the common people. The serious work is for the priesthood, not the laity. This is for the priests. The priests have to go through this rigor. What the laity have to do is like the Catholic model. You got to do your Baltimore Catechism. You got to do your catechism, and you got to be loyal, and you got to be grateful. And what it does play in well with is the control of information. And I think that the relationship, and this is a whole separate lecture, a whole separate people's research. What is the party's desire in its relationship with the Laobaixing, with the masses? And Mao actually had a higher opinion of the masses. He thought they could actually become revolutionaries. I don't think Xi Jinping does. Right? These are people to be managed, and that's so. In that sense, it's Confucian, right? It's patriarchal. Well, that's obvious, but it's hierarchical. And so I keep saying that Xi Jinping has been tough on intellectuals, but I think he's been tougher on party members because, like the Yongzheng emperor, he's pissed off. He knows what creeps these party people are. Their hands are in the till. And he is just taking names and as we know, taking prisoners. So it's I guess my point is the stuff I'm looking at is not orthogonal, but not directly related to the rising nationalism, but it aids and abets and uses it, is what I would say, because it distracts the common people from going into business that is not their business, about the ruling of the place. And it keeps them grateful and loyal to the party. So sure.
Great, thank you. I have one more question, then I will let you go. Another question I found that's kind of like fascinating is, do you see any sort of resemblance or some major sort of difference in terms of the way Xi Jinping bring about ideological dominance and the way Donald Trump bring about ideological divide and sort of another way of dominance in this country? Because I think those two countries, as two of the most powerful nations in the world, the stuff that's going on is really fascinating. Ideological divide becomes such a prominent sort of political feature in the United States. In the meantime, in China, Xi Jinping is also promoting ideology. So do you see the similarity or some kind of resemblance between what Xi is doing and what Donald Trump represents here in the US?
I think the philosophers would call it a family resemblance. It looks like quacks like. Yes. And I mean, and so, but this is where we need our political scientists to help us with populism and looking at populism over the left-right spectrum. And there are many fine scholars who've worked on this. And yes, I think Xi Jinping is very much drawing on some populist models. It's not just in North America, United States, Canada, Europe, where the one party gets elected and beats the other party out, but takes over 65% of their same policies, right? And so, Xi Jinping took Bo Xilai down, but he noticed that Red Song stuff was kind of selling well, right? And if you look at Xi Jinping's actual policy stuff earlier, it's two things. One is, he's really about, the party is important, but he's pretty flexible on various things to do. So I think he looked at the populist stuff and says, this stuff works. And the key thing is, and which by hearkening back to the 10 Lives book, why I love Yang Guoping's chapter, Guo Mei Mei, it's nobody's paying attention to the party. When he did the first draft, I said, this is a book about the party, you got to mention the party a couple of times, and it wasn't his fault. It's because that's how it was. And, part of what Xi Jinping is saying is you have to have the party. People have to go to mass on Sunday. This is not working.
Thank you, Tim. So we have to have the party, and we've had Xi Jinping pushing the party into some areas where it either was not well represented, in his opinion, or had withdrawn. And so we certainly see that on the economic front. Now, one question that comes up, you just described this pedagogical state tradition, right? This long tradition of the emperor as father, teacher, that sort of model. And you just cited Yongzheng and his mode of operation.
But very much picked up by Sun Zhongshan and Chiang Kai-shek.
And that's what's so striking, is that all of these leaders felt a need or saw an opportunity to use this idea of ideological governance. And so you've emphasized that in your article. And so I'd like to ask you this question, and that's whether or not ideological governance, this pedagogical state where there's a fixation of discipline and loyalty among party members, but also using the party to supervise everyone else, is there a contradiction between that and the regulatory state that we had some of the technocrats promoting? And is there a contradiction with that reformation that we associate with Jiang Zemin and the three represents, so that you can have billionaire capitalists as members of the Chinese Communist Party?
I'm totally with you. I think the most important theoretical development in Mao Zedong thought is the three represents. We all giggled at the time, but it's like explaining to the church that priests can get married, you don't need to use contraception, and Jesus maybe didn't make it back. So you better have a pretty good explanation for this. I mean, what a change to say that capitalists can be part of the party, and the intellectuals and specialists should be honored, and no more class struggle. And that's the three represents, and it's very, very important. Well, Clayton, you're absolutely, that's the big thing, the big contrast. So there is this tradition of Shiyang, practicality in the party. And one of the things that comes up in the 10 Lives book is, the Communist Party was crushed 3 or 4 times. And they were just, you could say, very willing or very shameless. They just gave up on the previous ideology that they were tormenting people for not following last year, but now it's a new ideology. So, here's the new book, just, beef up on that. And so, hey, it's industrial workers. No, it's peasants. No, we're going to have a united front with intellectuals. No, we're going to be a Soviet Union. No, we're going to have a Great Leap Forward. You know, and then reform and opening. And so you're absolutely right. And that's why I was so happy to have both the Jiang Zemin and these Zhao Ziyang and the Jiang Zemin chapters, because Zhao Ziyang really articulated this. And you're saying, and I do think it's reasonable to hearken to NEP. That's a practical Leninist response saying, we're not at the right stage yet. This is what we need to do. We'll be in charge, but we'll let these things happen, right? And then what's wonderful about the Jiang Zemin chapter 20 years later is the cost of that is the party's not very relevant. You know, and some people in the party decided that was a bad thing.
Well, and you might suggest that one reason to have three represents, one reason to try and bring these people in is to address that relevancy question, right? To say, you folks are going to be part of this governing body, this ruling body. And here is where you get that break that you highlighted towards the end of your presentation between Mao seeking to transform society, trying to transform the human spirit, and Xi Jinping saying, no, we'll make, carrots and sticks do the job. We will have rewards, we'll push in this direction, and we're not going to expel people for their expertise. We want more of it. We want to cultivate it. If I could ask a question then about how does this play? And this speaks to something that I may just asked about, is how does this play more generally? Because as you know, the going after tigers and flies has been very popular, was very popular with the masses because they knew or suspected that corruption was widespread and that some people were benefiting from economic opportunity more than they themselves. So you just said that, this ideological governance is about keeping the party in line. And that statecraft, this is something that, Han Feizi would have been content with, right? He would have seen some utility here. But at some point, you have to deal with the 1.3 billion people who are not party members. Mm-hmm. And how does that work? What message are they supposed to take from the tightening of this ideological framework?
I think it is, this is Xi Jinping's, the idea, Xi Jinping thought, that's what we're calling it now. He's calling it that. It is an ideology for a ruling class. And so I'm put in mind of James C. Scott's public transcripts and secret transcripts. We all know about the secret transcripts, but there's a chapter in that book about public transcripts, which is, even the elite need to have a story to tell themselves that for your elan. For the public, Xi Jinping knows that the reputation of the party on the ground is not good. For corruption and famous big corruption people. Hey, there's corruption going on in other countries. Sometimes the elites don't pay attention until a Donald Trump or someone comes along and articulates what some folks may feel about that. But for Xi Jinping, he knows he has to show that the party is worthy of the respect and the obedience that he is requiring, right? And so how do you make transformational bureaucrats? And I think he's drawn from Liu Shaoqi on that. And that leaves aside a whole series of questions that are empirical, like, well, does it work? Which I have some serious doubts about. But I'm trying to understand what he thinks he's doing.
Yeah, by reinvigorating the party and by, again, deputizing these 90 million members to carry out these things.
And it's supposed to be a noble vocation. And, Zhang Shigong is not a stupid person. That's a very knowledgeable, he wrote the Hong Kong white paper, which not such great news. And his paean to Xi Jinping thought is I don't like it, but it's intelligent. And it's not just, blah, blah. And there are others who are not, you're saying, how does this play? It's not just the 90 million party members and an unwashed, Chinese public. We all know there's Chinese society segmented, there's all different kinds of people and, ranges. And, what is interesting to watch is how does it work at these different levels? I'm a student of Philip Kuhn and, his Soul Stealers book, right? You remember, he says, Chinese culture is uniform, but not homogeneous, right? Everybody could experience the soul stealing crisis, but the Qianlong Emperor, the Confucian bureaucracy, and the Liao Baixing had very different experiences. They were talking about the same thing, they were using the same words, and they were having different dreams. And I think that's a useful approach as we look for the Chinese dream and Xi Jinping thing. So intellectuals, the people that David Ownby translates, some of them like Cui Jiyuan, Wang Hui, they think it's all pretty good. Gan Yang goes here and there, they're thinking there's a lot in the party history that's got to be brought back. And so, they've ended up being very statist, which is, boy, when you read their stuff 20 years ago, you didn't expect that to happen, right?
Yeah, and you've emphasized, Lenin's new economic program, the NEP, and one of the questions that we got in the Q&A section asked for, can we talk about Marxism? Is Marxism relevant, or is Leninism the only story?
Well, hey, I refer you to David Ownby's my article, Make China Marxist Again. It's in Dissent, and you can get it for free on the web, and it's short, but and it also introduced some of the thinking of Zhang Shigong. Is it Marxist? It's Chinese Marxism, right?
Yeah, well,
which is an enriching synthesis, a sublation of the thesis and counter thesis. There are really real parts, but liberation of the working class is just it's not there. Or at least I don't see it. It is a populist, nationalist, dare I say, national socialist ideology at this point.
Okay, and so you have an effort to rein in the super rich, and poverty alleviation is, of course, very, very high on the agenda, and apparently has been officially extinguished. Mm-hmm. But you don't have that emphasis on class, because discussing class in today's China is, talking about breaking things up, fomenting struggle. And so let me ask a question. I want to go back to Professor Yang in just a moment, but a question bringing together several things that we have from Professor Denise Ho, and we have from Dan Chow and a lot of others, asking, okay, Xi Jinping has this for the party. How does that work for those on the fringes of China, ethnic minorities, special administrative regions, and for China's diplomatic efforts abroad?
I was trained in, as a sinologist, but boy, my Ming and Qing chops are pretty rusty. And I sure could use some help from my colleagues who are doing live work on the Ming and the Qing, because these things resonate for me. The Ming had this absolutely rigid picture of foreign, relations. And meanwhile, society, it was illegal to leave China for most of the Ming and the Qing. So how did a couple million Nanyang Huachao get there, right? And did they all sneak out? They worked with local officials. And when I co-taught with Tim Brooke, we kind of developed this. And so I call it the insubordinate society. And I think China is still richly is that. Guomei reflects it as well. But Denise Ho's question is really good. What about outside, going beyond the party itself? So the short answer is for the Lao Baixing, for the regular folks, what's required is loyalty and turning up for ritual events, and keep your nose out of trouble, and we'll deliver things for you. But for the diplomats and for overseas, the United Front Work Department we use as the general model for the overseas soft diplomacy. It's a real problem. And I just do not envy being a Chinese diplomat these days, because like the Qing and like the Ming, this ideological governance requires an unbending ritualistic requirement. So think of Lord Macartney and Qianlong and the Ketou and the kowtow, right? And, too many of China's diplomats now are saying, if you don't kowtow, you're going to have Belt and Road trouble, and of course, my family is Australian, and you got to love it. Only Australians, as a small country that's economically dependent on China, just pokes them in the eye. That's Australia, right? So, just, looking for trouble and getting it. So this is a very big problem for being a global power, because this ideological governance, this is part of what I was referring to, is that it might have worked well when China is trying to mobilize a traditional society. And this is the heart of Ken Jowett's thesis, is that Leninism is able to connect traditional society and rational bureaucratic society through this bizarre thing, the party, right? And look, it worked. It worked. But it's not great for doing international relations unless you take the NEP Zhao Ziyang version of it. So it is not impossible. It has been done. It's just not being done now. And I don't see the current leadership being very interested in it. So I think it's bad for us going forward. We're going to have a very ideologically rigid foreign affairs office in China, demanding all kinds of ritual obedience. And, we're not interested in doing that.
Well, especially Australia. But yes, we've seen it. We've seen it elsewhere. Professor Yang, did you want to raise a question or comment?
I just want to echo that, because I think even though I wasn't doing that, but I was in contact with several scholars in China that specialize in public relations and public diplomacy for the Chinese government. Some of them are really at the provincial sort of leadership level. So a lot of them are spending humongous amount of energy and time and resources into this project called How to Tell the Story of China. It comes directly from the center of CPP, and the goal is to tell a better story of the Chinese dream, the Chinese ideology and things like that. So what I saw in that effort was this realization that there is an image problem. There is an overseas sort of backlash against China. But what the sort of central government was trying to do is to throw money at this problem and trying to hire better PR agencies, both within China and maybe around the world, and working with maybe like lobbyists to kind of like get away with, we are not going to change anything, but we want to tell a better story.
Right. I mean, we don't need to be in people's head. You're absolutely right. And it's a fascinating story. In this internet world, even I learned, do you remember the 5-minute video, 3-minute video on the Shisan Wu, the 13th 5-year plan? It has
the VW microbus.
Yeah, it has an earworm of a tune, ding, 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 right? And its message is all great, but we don't just make this stuff up. There's this report and that report and that report, So it was very successful. It was done by a British company, I believe. The problem is, you get the hardliners, who say no. Everybody has to admit, and so. Again, it's like the Catholic Church, you take your various parts, Jesuits and Dominicans or whatever you like. And so it's and also I'm mindful in the Qing, for instance, there was some, there were the hardliners and there was different views of the Qing Yi, who are going to say, no, we got to be pure. And the others are going like, look, we got to work with the world the way it is. The difference, of course, is for the late Qing, China was weak and China's strong now. But if look at High Qing, how they're handling it. So yes, there's this very orthodox, restrictive ideology coming out of the party center or out of the Beijing, or Nanjing for the Ming. But there's always been statecraft and rational works within it. I think it's one of the things in our pre-conversation you raised, Jaime. It's a big country with a lot of different kind of people. And so the problem is it's an American fault, and I share it, is we're looking for the good mullahs, right? We're looking for the good imams, the whole Iran thing. And so we're looking for the good commies, right? I think they're there. I think there's a range, and I think the history book of the 10 Lives shows some of that. But I wouldn't be betting the red on it. They're not in charge. I want to come around. Robert Lucero.
Yes.
Lucero, great comment about Sun Yat-sen and the Belt and Road. And do I see Belt and Road drawing in part from Sun Yat-sen's international development of China? Oh, absolutely. And Wang Shiwei, no, Hu Hanmin in 1929 had this whole idea of how the Chinese Revolution, this is of course the Kuomintang Revolution, is going to liberate the world. So it's not just America that's going to make the world safe for its form of governance. That kind of idealism was in a range of Chinese political thinkers going forward. But yes, I think to understand Xi Jinping, you got to understand Sun Yat-sen going forward.
Nation builders, definitely. Professor Barry Naughton has asked a question about the sociology of the party itself. So I don't know if you've looked at, who's been kicked out, who has been, brought back, these kinds of things. But he asked the question of, were people pushed out? And certainly people lost positions of power, but were they pushed out of the party? Or was the party a big enough tent under Zhao Ziyang, Jiang Zemin, to have people who were more of the Maoist bent, or today's Xi Jinping?
Yeah. Right. There's always been that diversity, and Liu Shaoqi in his cultivation was trying to figure out how do we deal with that, and allow people to have their views, but also we got to come to a decision and get some work done. Barry's question is very good. Of course, you mentioned the first book that I was involved in. That was a joint book with Carol Hamren, and Barry did the chapter on Sun Yat-fan, the economist. So we've been thinking about this together for decades. I think it's a very important part of understanding what's going on. So I'm talking at a somewhat almost cultural history level, working from texts. We need to ask Alice Miller and Melanie Mannion and others, Bruce Dixon, who are the people, and exactly. So Barry, my answer is I don't know, but it's a good question. And what I think of, anecdotally, we've all seen people we've worked with who seem to be a little closer to the party at certain times and then further away from it. The person I think of is, for example, someone we all loved in the West, which is Yu Ke-ping. Yu Ke-ping, democracy is good. He's a Brookings Institute favorite, right? A pretty reasonable guy. And, and he was talking about, why don't we democratize the party? That's, back then, 80 million, 75 million people. And that's a great start. That's bigger than a lot of countries, 3 times the size of Canada. Make that be really democratic with a real rule of law and multiple candidates and stuff. And then we really can be transformational bureaucrats and train the rest of the country how to be democratic. Well, he's out of the government and back at Beidang. Now, he's not in jail, but he's not in the position that he used to be. So I see people kind of shifting in and shifting out. And you go back to Wang Anshi and Ouyang Xiu, right? The new laws in the Song, tout ça change.
Yeah, you don't need to justify to me the value of this historical approach, but this book definitely demonstrates it. And I think the historical approach gets us out of a fixation on Xi Jinping as a single individual. He is drawing upon things that others have proven effective. I'd like to ask a question, though, that's very 21st century, and that's the question of technology. Now, I may raise this question, talking about what's on Weibo and Weixin and, what's going on in social media. And we see the uses the party is making of technology partly in making music videos, not just about Shi Wu, but also about Siga Chen Mian, these four comprehensives.
Oh,
And
what
stuff
about
like
what
that.
about Wings of Song?
That's
La La Land goes to Xinjiang.
yeah, the most recent musical effort on that front. And we've got questions about other people, one who's in the book, Guo Mei, and she is a creature of social media. And so maybe you could say something about the role of technology. We have an app to study Xi Jinping, thought. And that app, of course, collects all kinds of data about whether or not we're putting in the requisite amount of time and that sort of thing. So maybe you could say something more about how the 21st century and the technological advances, particularly in communications technology, has affected this. When we lived in China, you had 2 hours of political study twice a week. It's a different game.
And the morning broadcast, 6 o'clock, 各位同志，今天人民日报的社论就说, right? Wake up to the sounds of that. I was always very cheerful in the 1980s. The technology is absolutely key. And I'm so happy about the Guo Mei chapter is she kind of captures it, as almost like an image of how out of touch the party was, because this is before they did the crackdown on the Big V and the Weibo in 2013, and it's really with not just her, but stuff like that. And the party finally realized that this is completely out of hand, that they did not have a handle on this, and things were going on that they were not in control of, and they have worked very hard. And I think we've all learned the tough lesson the idealism of the .com and internet is it does not make us free any more than printing made us free, right? And there are scurrilous broadsides all through Jacobean England, and if you actually look what has published in American presidential campaigns in the first 200 years, makes Donald Trump look normal. I mean, the rubbish that has been said. I mean, I may, you can please correct me, but the little bit that I've read is like, oh my God, Thomas Jefferson did that. But here's the point. The bad news is they're winning at this point. The party's winning. They've got intelligent people. They've got money. They've got, Huawei has a lot of better technology at this point. And they're using it unconstrained by the niceties that other governments sometimes feel. So the application of it in Xinjiang and Tibet, finally people are waking up to that. It's horrible for the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and other Muslim citizens of China who are subject to this AI regime, but it's just a testing point for general use. And I think they fully intend to run it through the whole country because it's a technological extension of the ideas of ideological governance. It just makes it easier and better for them to do their stuff. So are we all heading to dystopia? Read Maoism at the Grassroots. Which is Jeremy Brown and Matt Johnson, particularly Matt Johnson's one on propagandists showing films in the early 60s. They were sneaking in Hong Kong films so that they could get enough people to buy tickets. Wushu films, right? I mean, these were people who believed in the story and stuff. They were not like dissidents, right? So there's always slippage, and there was slippage in the Ming Qing period as well. And I think that's where the hope is. But it's going to take the creativity of the documentary filmmakers and others across Chinese society, and some establishment intellectuals who say enough of this extreme rubbish. We've got to find something that is more, we say liberal because in English we know we mean that means that's a more latitudinarian, but it sounds bad in Chinese. So I call it more kaifang, or fang and not shou, right?
Yeah.
So the technology is key. It's where the battle will be.
That release. Just a couple more questions, and we'll ask Professor Yang maybe to ask the last one. But the question I have now refers to your comment about the party's discipline and inspection commission is now the most important work team, and because it is ensuring discipline. Whether or not it's getting loyalty is a whole separate question, but the discipline part of it. And maybe you could say something about that. That's very much a part of Liu Shaoqi's formula, how you get in, how you make it, you bring a village along, these kinds of things, the work team approach. And maybe you could say something about the mechanics of that and how that's changed from the 1940s to today.
I think the key difference today is that the work teams are pretty much limited to the party and major government offices themselves. And of course, the Discipline and Inspection Commission is not the only work team style thing. That there's, and there's a rectification going on in the Zhangfa, Xitong, the legal system, and there's others that are, and of course, the whole military relationship. But they are all under the work team model of higher level party groups sent to deal with lower level party groups. We need to talk to our colleagues who do the field work in sociology and things, and get out there on the streets and say, well, do they see this sort of thing happening? Is it really extended? Because the thing about work teams in the four cleanups in the early 1960s, 62, 3 to 65, was they were going into villages, and it was meant to rectify party cadres, but it really included the populace. And the key difference here is, I don't see a lot of populace participation. The participatory Maoism is not part of the Liu Shaoqi model. There's the snitch line, which you gotta love, right? That you can turn people in, but that kind of harkens more to a Soviet. The core of Chinese communism was get people to do it to each other.
Yeah. So, as you say, you have these mechanisms using the web to report malfeasance where you see it, but you don't have any struggle session. You're not going to have that.
Not a mass struggle session that I've seen. Others
Right.
may have seen it. You have some things, but they're showboat things. Good old-fashioned Maoist struggle session was meant to change the people doing the struggle. And if you knock off a few of the old folks and there's a few extremes, well, you send a plaque to the family.
Well, that's it. They were participatory specifically to bring people in, to make them a part of this process, and to have them feel a stake in the outcome of
There's
this.
an important part of this, and Denise raised the first part of it, which is the influence overseas. Look, we all know the story that the economic reform and marketization in China after 1978, and particularly going into WTO, was supposed to make China democratic. Who actually thought that or not, you can argue. Bill Clinton apparently thought it. And it certainly hasn't. But it has made China globalized. And every little village has, can watch, Dukes of Hazzard or Family, Friends. I think Friends is the one that's popular. And the Korean, soap operas, etc. Right. So this is the problem with ideological governance, which is it was made to work in the China of the 1940s and the 1960s, where the party did have more control. And so what Xi Jinping's trying to do is going like, it's not working. They're watching too much other stuff. Oh, I know what to do. Let's stop the stuff that they're watching. And I don't think you can go back to the future. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. China is globalized, and the party that is going to survive is the party that can manage that. And I don't see the current ideological governance model being very, very promising.
And so a counter-revolution is not the nimble, agile, adaptive party.
Counter-reformation.
Sorry. What did I say? Counter-reformation approach is not the means of revitalizing. You see it as hardening, as affirming the need for discipline, loyalty, and this sort of thing, but not being sufficiently adaptive for a more dynamic environment that China's in today.
Yep, and that and a transit card will get me on the bus.
Indeed. Professor Yang, any final questions?
I just have one last question. I think the conversation is really illuminating. I was wondering, like, because all know, like, the tension between US and China is going kind of like uh, increasingly intense over the years. Ever since Donald Trump is in US government, it seems like the relationship trends has gone south. Like the relationship between US and China has derailed. I wonder, what do you think that kind of tension would do to the ideological sort of campaign that Xi Jinping is currently waging within China? Do you think that's gonna force him to adopt, or force his party to adopt a different approach? Or do you think that would further sort of in some way help him because external pressures make it easier to unite people within? What's your thoughts on that front?
It's a really important question. And at first blush, indeed, getting negative pushback, negative stuff, getting criticized in Western newspapers, particularly when they go overboard a bit and bleed very easily into implied or active racism. And when the FBI acts like the Keystone Cops, just Chen Shui-shen all over again, stupid, Wen Ho Li all over again. Do we ever learn? And that just plays straight into the hands of the conservatives. And so, I see this ideological counter-reformation as a conservative turn within the communist Leninist tradition. One way to think about it. And so, so that's not good. But on the other hand, one other lessons from history that came very clear to us in the 10 Lives book is that the party defers to material reality. That in the end, a leader emerges who says, sorry, folks, it's just not what we want. We're not going to make it back to the cities in 1929. So we're going to have to make a change. And we're not going to, be able to do everything we want the Soviet way. We're going to have to find another way to do it. And, in the reform and opening was just like, we are not strong enough to do this. We have to step back, right? And so in terms of international relations, Cai Xia's in the newspaper, now saying, don't even try to engage with China. It's a lost cause. Build up your defenses. My approach is, it doesn't work. You don't want to. I wouldn't recommend the Australian approach of purposely ignoring Beijing, but you say, look, this is what it takes to deal with us. We'll deal with you respectfully. You deal with us respectfully, but it is force majeure that will change party policy. And that means, in terms of current policy, and this is not my research area, but it means if the liberal countries form their own united front and do some collective bargaining and also do a better job of running their home countries, that will change the material world. And I think that the communist leaders are, if nothing else, historical materialists.
So creating an example worth emulation might be a step in that direction. One giant topic, and we're going to have to close it here, but one giant topic that we haven't explored, tied to something that you just said about this being a conservative movement. And of course, anything that harkens back to Yongzheng or to the Song dynasty long before that, that would be a conservative response in many respects, is the question of gender. And you used the word patriarchal state, and I opened with a photo of the Politburo, and it's one female member, right? That sort of question. Yeah. And one of the things that we'll be looking at with Teresa Wright in a few weeks is the Me Too movement and its place, but also the tension over efforts to organize anything in civil society not guided by the party, even if all you want is to have women not being subjected to molestation on the bus, right. That is seen as a threat. So is that part of the fragility of this approach, that it's not dealing with the contemporary reality of a whole new mindset.
And this is part of the globalized China, if you like, or and it's also its internal development. Chinese women are sick of this stuff. And it's you know, we have three women in the book. Shang Guan Yunshu, you know, the actress, Wang Guangmei, top politician, and Guo Meimei. But that only touches, you know, I don't think we do justice to the issue of it. And it is a patriarchal system. I mean, what does Xi Jinping talk about? Is he looking for the nanzi? You know, who's got the cojones to stand up like Gorbachev didn't, right? You know, it's all this male stuff. And the question is, what can women do in the party? Or is the party just so patriarchal that they got to find another way? The second and last thing is, you talked about NGOs. A lot of the most successful NGOs, a little bit that I've read about, go right into the party. They get close to the party, and they have their Xi Jinping quote. And because they are just looking at, we want to stop domestic violence. You know, we want to, you know, not get roped on the bus. And we're happy to express our gratitude to the party if you actually help us do this. And that's okay. You know, I mean that. And so I think, you know, when I deal with, you know, establishment intellectuals, I call it agency through exegesis. So you interpret that whatever the doctrine of the day is, move towards what you're going. But it's a great question, and it's you know, we need you need to get someone who knows something about that on this.
We're on it, Tim.
All right.
Thank you so much for bringing so much into existence. This is a wonderful book. I can't recommend it enough. And everybody has been looking in the chat at the links to those articles, both the Counter-reformation article and the earlier article about making China Marxist. Again, Professor Timothy Cheek, Professor Aimee Yang, thanks to you both. And thanks to everybody who's with us today. In a few days, the video of this event will be up on our website and our YouTube channel, and we hope that you will share it with friends and colleagues who might not have been able to join us today. Thanks to everyone for giving the most precious thing any of us have, our time. Amen. Take care, everybody. We look forward to having you with us again soon.